Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Well, I'm really excited today because a fellow blogger in the ecological space, although I can't really call myself an ecological blogger really, I'm just somebody who's blogging on coaching that happens to use an ecological framework, but a genuine ecological researcher who also blogs, who I've been following the research for quite some time and spending quite a lot of time scratching my head trying to get my head around the concepts. Andrew Wilson has joined me from Leeds Beckett University. He and his colleague Sabrina Golonka, is that the right way to say it? Yeah, have been putting out some really good and fascinating information that I've been really interested by. Andrew, welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure, and it's always fun to try and have these conversations and just find out what other people are thinking and interested in as well. It's always good. So thanks for having me.
Well, what's great about this, hopefully, is obviously, I know you're doing sort of quite practical research, and I'd be really interested to talk to you about that as well. But you're doing some really interesting studies, and really, kind of very much, I feel anyway, at the cutting edge of trying to make sense of some of the theories and trying to give them a practical context. And I feel as if I'm in a similar space because I'm like, live, with 30 under 11s trying to sort of bring these concepts to life and making a lot of mistakes, but also, learning at the same time. So it'd be useful to hopefully just sort of compare and contrast our experiences. As a starting point, I wonder if you could just sort of, kind of give us the backstory around how you ended up in this exciting and wonderful space and your background in terms of research and coaching, all that sort of stuff.
So, I got a lot of lucky things happen to me, basically. I just ended up in the right place at the right time for a while. So I'm from New Zealand originally. And so I was doing my undergraduate at the University of Otago. And I was in psychology there. And I was doing very, very good old-fashioned cognitive psychology was actually my primary interest there. I was just very intrigued. It was the 90s. So we were all very excited about connectionism and neural networks and things like that. So that was very cool. And so I was just kind of intrigued by this. And then right at the end of my time there, I accidentally discovered dynamical systems. Weirdly, like I read an article weirdly about some people trying to use chaos theory to update Freud, would you believe? Right. And so I started reading around that and made some contact with some people and got really kind of intrigued by the idea of dynamical systems and thought that was kind of fun. And then took a year on an exchange program and ended up in upstate New York, just to finish my degree off, just on an exchange. And there, just happened to meet some professors. The main thing they did for me was actually they introduced me to the idea of going to grad school and getting a PhD. I'd always kind of assumed I would keep tracking on, but I hadn't really thought about it in any sort of detail. And so they introduced that idea. So then I started looking around for schools and I found Indiana University, which is one of the hubs of dynamical systems, everything in psychology. So I looked around and Indiana was pretty much the place I wanted to go work with. And so I applied and I got in. I was fortunate enough to get in. That was exciting. And I started working with Linda Smith actually in her developmental lab. But then I met Jeff Bingham, who became my PhD supervisor, and he is an ecological psychologist. He's a Turvey student actually. So he's one of the sort of the very early generation of ecological types. And I met him. He was teaching a history and systems class and I was his TA. And basically for Jeff, the history and systems of psychology begins with the Greeks and peaks with Gibson. So I was like, who is this Gibson person? That sounds cool. So we started chatting and then I ended up switching into his lab because I just got really bitten by the bug. The things that Jeff was doing and the ecological approach and the idea that you could study perception and that perception was much more interesting than anybody had ever told me, and that it was, if you started there, you could end up explaining quite a lot of interesting things about behavior. That just really caught my imagination. So I was super lucky enough to be able to work with Jeff. And he taught me, pretty much everything I know, but not even close to everything he knows. So I was very privileged to be able to work with him, and he and I still very active collaborators, which is great. So that got me into, and so for my PhD, I started studying coordinated rhythmic movement, which is a very basic sort of task, but it's a really useful kind of task that I used to study learning, more recently transfer of learning. So actually we're starting to get into the idea of how do you get transfer? And actually a lot of the coaches that I've started interacting with, of course, that's one of the questions, right? You go from a training session to the game context. How do you design your training session so that it overlaps in a meaningful way with your game context, so that what you do in training, how does skill acquisition, how do you get it into the game context? So we're dealing with that in a very kind of small way, but we're finding some very interesting sort of thing. We're developing a bunch of principles about what might be going on there. So that's cool. So it's a nice task, this coordinated rhythmic movement task, very simple, very straightforward. But it lets me, like you were saying early on, it lets me kind of really road test the theoretical ideas, and it really lets me, really take those for a walk, really develop the intuitions, really figure out how to connect them to data. And I found that actually that whole arena has really given me it's a very concrete place to stand while I try and figure out slightly more complicated things. And so after that, I did a bunch of postdocs. So I followed around. I went to Aberdeen for a few years, worked with Mark Williams, down to the University of Warwick for a year, and then got a job in sports science at the University of Leeds. I was there for 3 years, and then I got a position back in psychology. I like sports science, and it was an interesting sort of time for me, but I'm more of a psychologist by nature. The questions are less about sort of motor control and more about behavior and sort of, so I'm happier in a psychology department. So I ended up at Leeds Beckett, where I've been since 2012. And so they've just promoted me, so that's quite exciting. So that's good, actually. It's been really good, actually. It's been a really productive time for me. And I've got a lot of really useful collaborations now. I'm working with the Carnegie Sports Science team on a bunch of cool stuff. So that's kind of how I got there. It was a series of just, that dynamical system stuff seems interesting. Oh, look, Indiana's doing interesting dynamical system stuff. Oh, hi, Jeff. How's it going? What's this Gibson stuff? And I ended up, a bunch of things that had caught my attention. I got lucky enough to be in the right place where I could turn that into something, which was very cool.
So I suppose a jump off point here, as attracted as I am to getting into the weeds around some of the rhythmic movement stuff, I'm hoping we'll definitely go there. Yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah. But a good starting point is that, you've talked about dynamical systems theory and ecological psychology.
Yep.
And these are terms, I think, that are thrown around quite a bit, certainly in the coaching space, as more and more people are becoming aware of them. What are the distinctions? How do we understand the two of them? How do they interrelate? How does that work? So
it's a good question, actually, because the dynamical system stuff is very popular. It's very attractive. It's very powerful. But it often gets conflated with a lot of things. So for me, my take is this. Dynamical systems theory it's a fairly abstract sort of mathematical formalism, right? So dynamical systems theory is not about people in particular. It's not about it. What it is, it's a way of thinking about complex systems that change over time and that interact with each other. And it's a way of trying to being able to describe what's going on in those complex interactions in a way that you can get some kind of traction on, right? And the idea is that the maths is just a way of formalizing that description so that you can simulate it, play around with it, try and get to grasp with it. So for me, dynamical systems theory is the right language for describing these systems, how they work together, etc. But I've made this point a bunch of times. As much as I love dynamical systems theory, what a lot of people do is think that dynamical systems theory explains behavior, and it doesn't. And the reason is because it's not a theory of human behavior. It's an abstract description system for complex systems. You can apply it to one of the strengths is you can apply it to people, but you can apply it to chemical reactions, you can apply it to physics problems, all that kind of stuff. What you need, if you're going to understand people, you need a theory of how organisms are connected to their environment. And that's Gibson. That's the ecological approach. So the ecological approach is a theory about the nature of the world at an ecological scale. What is out there to be perceived? What is there to interact with? What do we have to be able to do in order to be functional? And it's also a theory about how we perceive that. So you get affordances. That's what's out there to be perceived. And you get information. So Gibson is a theory of people, or a theory of organisms, actually, and how they're connected to their environment and to each other. And dynamical systems theory is the right way to formalize those ideas. But if so, dynamics is great, but if you want to study people, you need reasons to ask certain questions, and dynamical systems won't get you there. Gibson will. So that's the way I kind of map that space out. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So they're, I suppose they sit or interact with each other really nicely.
Absolutely.
In terms of. So previously, I suppose the assumption is because within a dynamical system, it tends to be that humans behave in a certain way as a result of the way those systems interact. The assumption is that people behave because of these systems, but actually what you're saying is the behavior is derived from what people are perceiving whilst they're within the system, and the way the system changes their perception changes their behavior, not the other way around.
Absolutely. That's exactly it. So another way to frame that's exactly right. And the way I would typically frame that is, for me, is that dynamical systems is the right way to describe what's going on. The ecological approach is the right way to explain what's going on.
Okay.
And the ecological approach uses dynamical systems theories to formally describe its explanations, but the explanation, the reason why something actually happened, lives over in the ecological part. But I liked the way you were phrasing that. That was bang on.
So forgive me if I'm oversimplifying here. So dynamical systems is almost like the what's happening, and ecological psychology is either the why or the how.
Fundamentally, yeah, right. That's exactly it. Yeah.
Okay. Right. I mean, that's actually a useful distinction, and probably something that I know certainly I've found myself getting sometimes a little bit kind of maybe using the wrong kind of terminology in certain different contexts. And I think it's probably useful for people out there who are working in this landscape to be able to understand that thing. Something else you just said there, which I think is really important as well, is you mentioned almost like a distinction between affordances and information.
Oh yeah,
that's worth that's worth pulling out.
Okay, yeah, this is a very important distinction actually, and this is the first thing that Jeff Bingham taught me actually, is that there is a very important distinction between the world and the information about that world that we use to perceive it. There's some very, very important distinctions about how that works. So how to best explain this? So actually, my nice simple example, coordinated rhythmic movement, right? It's not the most exciting task, but it's a nice place for where we've worked out a lot of these intuitions. So the coordinated rhythmic movement task, this is Scott Kelso's original thing, right? Where you get two fingers and you're wiggling them in some coordination, right? Same thing at the same time, or alternating, in phase, anti-phase, that kind of thing. But so often that'll be very familiar, I think, to a lot of people. So it turns out that when you're asking people to move in a certain way, there's only so many things you can do without training, right? People can do in phase, people can do anti-phase, but if you ask them to do something in between, the 90 degrees one, the sort of the syncopated rhythm, ba-bum, ba-bum, they can't do it without training. So the question is, why is behavior organized that way? Out in the world, there's no particular reason why those should be different, right? 90 degrees, 180 degrees, they're just very simple movements and coordinations of the system. So what turns out is that out in the world, things are, you describe things dynamically, things are out there. Now the question is, how did you perceive them? And so it turns out that when you perceive these coordinated rhythmic movements, you don't perceive relative phase. Relative phase is the thing that's out in the world. That's the description of the behavior of the world. Turns out, though, that we don't get direct access to relative phase. What we've got is these things produce motions, and they produce structure and light, and it's patterns of motion, it turns out. And it turns out that these patterns of motion that we use to detect relative phase explain why the behavior is so weird. Right? The variable we learn to perceive things in terms of relative direction of motion, turns out, and it turns out that explains why the behavior has this particular kind of structure that Kelso identified. So the moral of the story here is that the formal way to think about this is that the world is best described at the level of dynamical systems, right? You want to know how things are changing, their composition, what they're made of, but also the forces that are involved in why things are changing. But it turns out that those things out in the world, what they do is they produce patterns of change and motion in the optic array, the acoustic array, all the various energy media that we're sensitive to. And those patterns are what's referred to as kinematic. They're just patterns of motion over time, no false information. So the world is one thing. It produces information about itself. Those two things are not quite identical. And it turns out that our interaction is very important. We interact with information, right? That's our interaction with the world. So that information can specify what's going on in the world, but it's not the same. And so the structure of our behavior comes from the nature of the informational contact that we have with the environment. So the moral of the story is, if you're going to explain behavior, I can't, if I want to explain grasping behavior or, something, I need to be able to talk about my coffee mug, or I need to be able to characterize what it's like as a physical object. But I absolutely have to also characterize the layer of information that it creates, because that will not be identical, right? When I perceive this coffee mug, it's not like there's a little copy of the coffee mug coming to me. There's information about it, and it's informative and it's specific, but it's not identical, and it's not a little copy, right? There's not a little copy of the coffee mug that ends up in my head. And what I'm doing is I'm interacting with that information. So it's a slightly tricky point, but basically there is the world you have to characterize one way, and the information about it gets characterized in a slightly different way. And those two things are very tightly, very intimately, lawfully related, but they're not the same thing. And so if you want to explain behavior, you have to have all the pieces.
So, all right, let me see if I can try and grasp this concept, because I do agree it's quite a challenging one. So, if taking the example of a coffee mug, I might have never seen a coffee mug ever before. I've never experienced coffee. I've never experienced any other drink out of a vessel as such. This is my first experience with something made of ceramic with a handle. And I can, once I grasp it, I can understand kind of something about it in terms of its form, its shape, what it might be able to do, and all those sorts of things.
And those are actually the primary things that we interact with. The fact that it's a coffee cup is just a name we've given it. The perception cares about all the things you just said.
And so, I mean, I might take this thing, and I might be, so I'm experiencing it in a certain way, and then I'm going to start to explore what it might do. So, I might put it on my head and think, this would make a nice hat, but it doesn't balance very well in particular. Or I might, I might decide I'm going to carry it as a piece of jewelry or something like that. And again, I'll find it's not, whatever. But over a period of time, I'll discover that there's actually various ways in which I can interact with this coffee mug, and one of the things I can do with that is, and one of the things it probably is most useful for, is putting liquid in that I can then drink from, which obviously helps me with my survival. What I'm trying to work out there, though, is it the ways of interacting with the coffee mug that are the affordances, or is that the information?
Everything you described, affordances live in the world.
Right.
So everything you just described was the properties of the object and the way in which those properties enable you to do some things rather than other things.
Right.
All of those things live in the world end of the equation, right? My coffee mug is arranged, it's a surface that's arranged in a certain way such that if I put liquid into it, it'll hold it, right? It's arranged in such a way that it's a certain size so that when somebody like me with a hand about my size comes along, I could interact with it in certain ways, but not other ways, and so on and so forth. All of those things that you just described, those are those basic properties. Like I said, the fact that it's a coffee mug is irrelevant. The fact that it's an object of a certain size, certain weight, certain material properties, those are the kinds of things the system cares about. That's all out in the world. Those properties are, when they come together in the shape of a coffee mug, create the affordance of graspability, create the affordance of, containability, right? This thing can contain liquid, etc. Affordances live in the world. Affordances are about the way the physical world is. Now the question is, how did you perceive all that? So there's a bunch of different ways. So you were talking about picking it up and exploring. So obviously that's haptic exploration of the object. That's still a perceptual system. Just because you're in mechanical contact with it, turns out it doesn't actually give you any magical access. That's still a perceptual system. I can look at it visually. Those two, I can interact, visually guided reaching, and do all that, have those systems work together. The question is, what is my visual system interacting with? Well, my visual system's interacting with patterns in light that are coming off my coffee mug. And those patterns change as I move around the coffee mug. They change in certain ways, but they change. There's regularities in those patterns that tell me, oh, as I move around, I'm getting information about the size of that object, right? Because there's certain patterns and relations in the information that don't change. And And so what I can do is I can now use those patterns to guide and structure how big my hand is when I reach out for it, etc. And then I can fine tune that when I actually come in contact, and so on and so forth. So all the things that make the object afford anything, all those properties live out in the world. And my job is to perceive those using patterns in light, patterns in the deformation of my haptic system, right? Turvey's got a whole theory about how that works, and it's very interesting, but it's very turvy. But the idea is that there's stuff in the world, and I want to be able to perceive it. There's two different things going on there, right? So there's two different, for the system, it's all, from my actual engagement with the coffee mug, it's all basically one thing. For me as a scientist, if I want to explain what's going on, if I want to analyze the task into its actual components, I have to decompose the task into world bits, information bits, and organism bits. And that's where the language of affordances are the world bits. Turvey calls the organism bits effectivities. Those are the sort of the complementary bits that enable me to affect the affordance, right? So the fact that my hand is a certain size, etc., that sort of stuff. But the critical thing in the middle is that there's information in light, in various other arrays, and that's how I perceive the affordance, and it's that information that lets me use my effectivities, change the shape of my hand, change my location in space, etc., in order to interact with those.
And so if we manipulate either the organism bits, the effectivities, or we manipulate the available sources of information by, for example, constraining and reducing various aspects of ability, what we're then changing is what an individual organism, what we then change is the amount. I suppose it's a bit like an aperture on a camera, where the affordances then change because there's only so many things that you can now perceive. And as a result,
the affordances are out there, but then your access to them, absolutely. So if you're altering the effectivities, if you're altering the information, what you're doing is you're altering access to the affordances, absolutely. And of course, that then immediately changes the whole loop, the whole perception action loop. That changes the organisms work in real time. They interact with what they have available to them now. And so if you alter that access, then their behavior changes and adapts, and they produce sometimes very different patterns of behavior. My favorite example of this right now is a paper I read recently by Ian Renshaw. He was looking at cricket batter behavior when they were facing a bowler versus a bowling machine, right? Yeah. And then, but it was the inspired bit of this paper was that they didn't just look at things like, accuracy or how well they hit the ball, etc. What they actually looked at was coordination patterns of the batter's whole body. So they measured a bunch of joint angles and looked at the timing of the forward step and a bunch of other things. And basically what they found was that the cricket batter, the expert batter, facing a bowler or facing a machine, was perfectly capable of hitting the ball. But because the bowling machine removes all the information that comes off the bowler about what they're doing and about what they're about to do, what happened was that in order to do it, they produced qualitatively different coordinated patterns of their body. So they achieved the same goal, but they did it in qualitatively distinct ways. And that was what that was showing, was that the information coming off the bowler as they approached for their delivery is something that the system has access to normally and is informative and actually is it's something the system has learned to use to shape its behavior. In the absence of that behavior, it's fine. It can still hit the ball, but it has to come up with a different solution. It has to time things differently because it can't time itself now relative to the behavior of the bowler. So it's a great example of at one level, what was coming, they did a lot of really clever things to make sure that the behavior of the ball coming out of the machine was very similar to the behavior of the ball coming out of the bowler's hands, for example. They did a lot of very cool stuff. And it turned out that wasn't what the system was interested in. The system was interested in a much more sort of expanded thing. And the moral of the story was, exactly as you were saying, the bowling machine is fine at one level, but it does create an aperture. It does restrict access to some information about some affordances. And the system was like, okay, that's fine. I can still behave. I can still produce an outcome. but I'm going to have to do it in a very different way. And so now then you get into questions of transfer, right? If you spend all your time batting against a machine and then you go out on game day and base against a bowler, then you haven't had any opportunity to learn any of that information about the bowler. And so all of your behavior, you're still going to be able to try and hit the ball, but you're going to be doing it based on information only about the flight of the ball. Of course, in cricket and baseball, you've only got 400 milliseconds for, and so on and so forth. So there's consequences potentially here. So yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And actually, it's very Ian's stuff's fascinating. He's been on the show early on, and talking actually largely about some of the his N=1 experiment with his son using a constraints model and developing him into an international cricketer of his own right. Interestingly, with that idea, then, so as coaches, we are, as we're constantly trying to use this information that we're getting from the kind of theoretical space as a means by which to help us with identifying better, I suppose, or more effective approaches to help our athletes in performance. So this transferability question becomes really essential.
Yes.
But I feel like, and I'd be interested just to get your thoughts on this, that often when for example, people will put an idea out there as a kind of game form of some kind, right? And often the response is somebody will often say, and even this is somebody got very, very ecological in their approach, and some people will say, well, I think you've constrained too many affordances there. Yeah, sure. It's not realistic enough. They're there. Now, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, there's got to be times when you have to, because otherwise there's far too many informational variables for you to attend to.
Yes.
So in that context, using what is ostensibly it's quite a constrained action anyway, batter versus bowler. It's not like there's a whole range of other pieces of information coming along. But in that context, what we'd say, so whereas previously we might be quite sniffy about a bowling machine and go, oh no, it's not really, you don't get the information sources that you need, and this, that, and the other. What we're saying is it might be that a bowling machine has a function for us, but we have to understand that function won't necessarily be immediate transferability to a performance. It might be useful as a means of learning about a particular movement pattern, for example, but we shouldn't think that will transfer into performance. There's probably a step in between.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So so I don't know if this would actually work, but basically the principle of what you're saying would be, right, the trick is to remember that time is a big chunk of this, right? That things happen in different orders, produce different behaviors, right? Time and ordering are very important. So potentially, I don't know if this is the right way to go, but I don't know what the best order would be, but one way might be you'd bring your batter in who's not so good right now. They're still developing some technique issues and there's still some basics that you want to work on. It might be the case that spending a little bit of time with a bowling machine just means that you go, look, you know what? You're going to have to learn about what bowlers look like at some point, because that's actually quite useful information. But right now, what I want you to focus on is something else. So we're just going to strip that out for the time being. We'll spend a little bit of time like this, but then I think you're exactly right. The trick is to remember that the bowling machine is not the same as the game context. It doesn't overlap in some interesting ways. And so, you might not get immediate transfer. But what the use of the bowling machine could just be a tool just to get the batter to a certain point where the basics of their technique are there. And then you go, oh, okay, now we can step you up. Now we can start having you, now that you've got, you know how to swing a bat, now we can start exposing you to the behavior of bowlers so that you can start learning the information that comes off them and how to use that in the control of the swinging the bat. And then you might expect more transfer. Yeah, so it's a really tricky, it's an old problem, right? So the question is, if you've got your game context, your full task-rich environment, all these kinds of things, the age-old question is, how do you break it down into components so that you can train those components without violating the basic rules or the essential sort of relationships in the full game context? Yeah, you can't. I think people tend to agree you can't just train on game context, right? You can't just throw someone into a full game. It's too busy. There's too much going on. You have to walk people into it. The question is, how do you do it in an organized fashion? Now, it's a very old question. There's not a lot of good answers right now. But that's, again, for me, I'm starting to explore this now using coordinated rhythmic movement. So it's, the particular details of the experimental results aren't going to help anybody. But we're using it to develop some intuitions about what the hell is a task? How could you break it? Like, what constitutes a natural part of that task? And how could you do that? So we're trying to use the ecological approach now to identify those parts, and we're starting to get some very interesting results now. So, but it's a very complicated question.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, what I was thinking about as we were talking about that, you mentioned about the kind of the basics of the technique.
yeah.
And again, I think where a lot of us have probably, if you think of this podcast as basically audible field notes
Right.
from people in the space, right? Just going, right, this is a problem. How do we solve this problem?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I'm doing. So in my world, one of the things that I'm trying to grasp is it about this fundamental idea? I mean, I think I even fell into my own trap a minute ago when I was talking about like steps in between and using a bowling machine. My point being is learning, comes from, if we're saying that kind of information is arising from what we're perceiving,
Mm-hmm.
the things out there in the world,
Mm-hmm.
what we're saying is that what we want to try and do as much as possible is to try and allow the learning to take place from something as close as possible
Yep.
to what we're likely to perceive. And what we're saying is with a bowling machine, whilst it might help with technique, the problem is that we don't know for sure whether that technique is going to be linked to that information source.
Absolutely.
So actually, you might fool yourself into thinking, I now have a movement solution that's going to solve a perceptual problem.
Yep.
But the only way you can know that is to test it against a perceptual problem. So my hypothesis that I test every day is, I would rather see if the movement solution can emerge, given some changes of constraints and information sources, from the perception that we're receiving, rather than saying, here's a movement solution that's likely to solve the problem in the future.
Absolutely.
And that's, I think, a fundamental challenge that a lot of people are struggling to grasp.
But that's the key of that's the ecological reframing of the problem right there in a nutshell, right? Yeah. Is that the recognition that behavior emerges in real time from the flow of information that you're interacting with. And that flow of information is generated by whatever's actually going on in the world. And if what's going on in the world is critically different, and in training is critically different from what's going on in the world in a game context, then the behaviors that emerge in training will not necessarily be relevant to the behavior, will not be a behavior that will necessarily emerge in the context of a game situation, and vice versa. So thinking about Ian's thing with the cricketer, it's entirely possible that you could use the machine to produce some technique improvement, but it's not like there's a correct technique, right? And actually Ian's data shows that what you learn interacting with a ball machine is one coordination pattern over your whole body, and what you learn in the presence and what you perform in the presence of a bowler is a different coordination pattern. They still at the end of the day produce a cricket shot, but the pattern of performance that produced that is very different. And if you want to learn the bowler appropriate one, you're probably going to want to have a bowler around during training at some point, because basically the moral of the story is people learn what they do, and what they do is engage with what in real time with what's currently present. And so if you train people in a context that is missing some critical element, then they will learn to solve a problem, but they'll come up with a solution that depends on things that were present in training. And if those things aren't present in training, so the transfer thing. So getting into this now, so my PhD student Danny Leach is working on this, and he's been doing an extensive review of the transfer literature. Transfer doesn't happen very often, right? There is learning does not transfer very easily. Learning is spectacularly task specific, which is a little weird, I think. Presumably, that's probably quite a strange thing to say to a sports coach, because the whole point of coaching is to generate transfer. What we're finding, though, is that what you learn is what you do, and what you do is learn how to interact with a very specific task dynamic, right? And the reason why it's so specific is that the dynamical properties of the training environment produce some information variables and not other information variables. And what you learn to do is learn to perceive a task dynamical context using the information it presents to you. If those information variables are not present in the transfer task, in the task that you're trying to transfer into, then you don't have access to that information, which means that if that information is not available, then whatever you used that information to the behavior to produce in training, you can't do it, because you're not learning how to bat. You're learning how to engage with the environment, right? And so what we're finding is that transfer is mind-meltingly task-specific. Our hypothesis that we're developing, and we're about to send out a couple of papers from Danny's first studies, is that the thing that governs transfer of learning is whether or not the tasks overlap in the information that they present. to people, and the way you present information in a real life context is that you have to have the right dynamical elements. You have to overlap. The tasks have to overlap in the dynamical elements that they contain, right? So you can't train. Let's think. You can't train soccer players to successfully pass a ball through a closing aperture of opposing defenders. You can't train them to pass a ball and expect that to transfer, because what they're learning is they're just learning how to pass a ball between themselves. But passing a ball and passing a ball through a closing gap defined by two defenders are two entirely different task dynamics. And the apertures, there's information about the aperture that you need to learn how to perceive and use to time your behavior, etc. Right? Danny's favorite example of this right now is a paper came out last year. Somebody trained people to balance on a slack line and to balance on a rigid beam. Right. And the idea was we're teaching them to improve their balance, capital B balance, right? So they trained them and got them really good, and they looked for transfer, nada, right? So there's no such thing as balance. There's balancing on a slack line, and there's balancing on a beam, and those two things are completely different because they're two completely different dynamical environments. They create different information variables. You have to interact with that task dynamic in very different ways in order to produce functional behavior. So learning on one, you're not learning to balance. You're learning to interact with a very particular task dynamic, a slack line, and you produce balance on a slack line. So it's quite a deep point, but it's the idea of if things overlap in their dynamical properties, they will also, just by the laws of nature, they'll overlap in the information that they present, and then you will expect some kind of transfer. So the goal now is to try and design something, a training context that overlaps in a meaningful way. And it's hard, right? We're still very much in the kiddie pool of figuring this out, but we're starting to get those principles out now.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because learning does not transfer very easily. I definitely, you can definitely feel that, right? And I think lots of us have kind of fooled ourselves into thinking this. And I think this is one of the reasons why kind of technique-led coaching, let's call it, is so prevalent and also so persuasive.
Yep.
I think it's in a skill acquisition context, I think it's fool's gold. Yep. And the reason I think that is because I think we as coaches who are desperate to see improvement and performance, and usually we want to see it right before our eyes because that gives us a sense that we've achieved our task. Yep. And it gives the performer a sense that they've achieved what they came to achieve. Yep. And so what we'll do is if we based on a task-specific learning context, we say, here is a task. It is devoid of information and perception. So it is massively simple, right? And through a process of either instruction or whatever it might be, you can become more effective at that task. Going back to the passing a ball back and forward, can we do it more often, more repeatable? Yes, just enough goes at that will enable us to do that. Right, we've been successful. The problem is that we sort of feel like, right, job done, finished. And I can totally get that because that, for me, that's definitely, you'd feel like that really worked for you. The problem is that what we're not doing is we're not deriving the task from that performance context.
That's it. That's exactly.
And when we see, I learned this through bitter experience, through watching athletes basically seemingly willfully disregarding things that we'd worked on in our training context in a game and screaming and shouting on the side, we've just worked on this, and kind of, it's the search for answers. Why? What is it me? Is it, yes, of course it's me.
They literally can't help themselves, right? They're trying to behave in one context. And nothing that they learned in that other context is useful. So they're trying to now figure out, in all fairness, a big chunk of this is our fault. And by our fault, I mean the research community, right? The motor control literature since the 60s, right, through the 70s, 80s, all that sort of stuff, the basic motor control literature was all about identifying the schema, the motor program. If we train you to swing a bat, you therefore now know how to swing a bat. And you should now be able to deploy that skill in a variety of contexts because you have this core competence.
Yeah.
And so that was based, that idea that what you were training is a core competence on a core capacity that you could then deploy, and context was just something that was noise, right, was the driving principle for motor control. It still is for a lot of the motor control literature in particular. All of Schmidt's stuff, for example, like Schmidt was a stupendously smart guy, and if you read his papers, he's really tackling and trying to engage with a lot of these problems. But the sort of the caricature of his work is all about these kind of core capacities and all this sort of stuff, and people developing schemas, developing motor programs, all that sort of stuff. The ecological flip that happens is that context is not noise, it's signal. And that, so instead, when you are training somebody, you're not training somebody to produce the core skill or the core capacity just because you could name it, right? Oh, look, I'm going to teach them to balance. It's like, well, just because you've got a word for it doesn't mean the perception action system cares a goddamn, right? So what it's doing is not learning a core capacity. It's learning how to skillfully engage with a particular dynamical context. And it's doing that on the basis of learning to detect and use the relevant information variables to interact with that task dynamic. So behavior is very much, it emerges in real time from the interaction of an organism with certain capabilities interacting with a task dynamic offering certain opportunities. And so what you're learning then is, so it's always behavior and context. Context is signal, right? And so that's it. So the issue then is, okay, we had this idea that you could take a task and you could decompose it into some parts, right? I want to teach you how to balance on a slack line and on a beam, so I'm going to decompose it into balancing and stuff like that. And the moral of the transfer literature is that we've been carving tasks up in the wrong place, as evidenced by the data, right? I train you on balance, nothing happens, no transfer at all. So the stuff that Danny and I are working on now, we're trying to develop an ecological vocabulary around this, centered on his empirical results. He's got a couple of very interesting experiments that we're working on the papers for now. And we're trying to come up with a vocabulary for how, as an ecological psychologist, we go about characterizing the broader task so that we can identify the behavioral relevant chunks. So what I think coaches are looking for is at least a set of principles for how to identify what constitutes a meaningful piece that you could potentially train in isolation and expect some sort of transfer. Because it's not impossible, right? You don't have to train on the full context in order to get improvements. You just have to break the task at its joints, right? So what we're doing is we're trying to develop a vocabulary for that. I always ground this in the empirical data around coordination, but just because it gives me a nice concrete place to think. So the empirical results are less of the issue. They're a demonstration of the principles that we're trying to develop. And the principle is basically information is what gets you transfer. The relevant structural overlap that the perceptual system cares about in order to generate transfer of learning is, do the two tasks share informational content? And you get informational content if you've got the same dynamical elements present in the two tasks. And that's it. That's how you get transfer. It's almost at one level, it's not transfer. It's not transfer of learning. It's what you've done is you've trained in the right context and presented people with all the relevant information, and then you've put them in a situation where all that stuff exists and is there, but also has a bunch of other stuff going around it. So it's almost as if learning hasn't transferred. It's what you've done is you successfully transferred the context.
Right.
Which is a whole different way of thinking about it. And so kind of what we're finding is that, learning doesn't seem to transfer. What you learn how to do, how to skillfully engage with the environment under certain circumstances. And then if those circumstances work in the other task, then you're golden. If those circumstances do not obtain in the other task, it doesn't help at all.
I was talking about this with somebody the other day, actually. And it's actually a baseball hitting coach. He's based with the Baltimore Orioles, and I think baseball batters have batting coaches are having a very similar kind of challenge, trying to sort of change behaviour of athletes, actually, to embrace different practice methods, particularly in that professional domain. There's so many challenges. But one of the interesting things there, I was sort of saying to him is that, strangely enough, it's almost as if it's like a kind of task design lottery, right? So what coaches are doing is they're going, right, we're going to give you some experiences of certain tasks, which we think, given, if the stars align, There'll be a moment in time which will be almost exactly the same, and you'll be ready for it, and it will all take place.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how it's been working. And when you frame it in that sense, then immediately the minute then you think, you just think to yourself, well, okay, well, there's absolutely no way we can now consider of skill development without some sort of contextual variable in place.
Yeah.
And the bit I suppose most of us are kind of struggling with is, task design becomes absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And I think most of us, and I'm definitely doing this, is that I'm kind of manipulating task design on the fly,
right.
based on the behavior that I'm seeing, or at least the way the interaction is taking place.
Yep.
And as a, and that way, and so that sometimes for some of us who've felt quite, in the previous, we've been quite ordered and structured, and we see a logical progression of our activity towards a natural endpoint.
Mm-hmm.
It feels really, really uncomfortable and really messy and really kind of like sometimes a little bit too like, do you know what? I just don't know if that worked. I don't know if that even resonated in the right way.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't really got a way of testing that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm working on my intuition.
Yep.
And so that becomes quite a challenge. I said to Ian Renshaw once, is the constraints approach, is an ecological approach to coaching and human behavior, is it something that only kind of like test pilots or astronauts can do? Because, you have to be so expert in doing so.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true, by the way. I think actually novices are almost better off because they haven't got a framework that they have to kind of disabuse themselves of. However, sorry, I'd just be interested to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a tough one. So that's it. What's clearly lacking right now is a way of usefully articulating what a task is. That's sort of when Danny and I are writing the papers right now, that's what we've kind of identified, is that the whole idea of transfer is premised on the idea that you train on something and you test it on something else, and the idea that those tasks overlap in some meaningful way. The problem, and that goes back to Thorndike, right? The whole idea is you only get to get meaningful overlap. But the question, it turns out, that nobody's ever been able to figure out the answer is, what the hell is meaningful overlap? Overlap in what, right? Two people kicking a ball, passing it to each other, well, that certainly happens in a game, but it turns out that doesn't actually help you pass through the aperture for the thing. So you need to try and find a way to decompose tasks. Now, the stage I'm at in my research and developing the framework, so I'm doing this in the context of coordination. I'm also doing this in the context of long distance targeted throwing. That's my other sort of research program that's going on right now. For me, what constitutes a task is you have to analyze the task at the level of its dynamics. And the problem is, and the big, in the lab, this is less of an issue, but for a coach, this is a disaster, because the real problem, the thing we've identified, is that learning is massively task specific, which means that, and if tasks differ a little bit or just sufficiently, right, then you're not going to get that transfer. They're going to be two different things. So you do end up, I think, in that situation where there is no such thing as a single right answer that's going to apply across a bunch of contexts. But it is also the case that there is behavior can group. So actually throwing is quite a good example for this. So I've been studying long distance throwing. And so the basic idea of throwing is that you move so as to produce a projectile motion, right? You move so as to make a ball, and once you let it go, that's it. That's your last chance to interact with it. And then the ball has to cross some space, and whatever happens is just a function of the local physics. So the dynamics of projectile motion, turns out, physics has been working on this for hundreds of years because we like shooting things. So that those mathematical equations are around. So what I can do is I can characterize the task dynamics. I can characterize the projectile dynamics that the person has to interact with in order to successfully hit a target of a given size at a given location. And then I can try and interpret their behavior relative to that dynamical description. What that gives you is, there is such a thing as throwing, in the sense of every throw is an attempt to interact with the dynamical description, but a throw to a given target involves changing the parameters, right? So you have to throw a little faster or a little slower or a little higher or a little lower. the two tasks are both throwing at the level of the dynamical description. But at the level of, if you describe the individual behaviors, you get two very different looking behaviors out. So that's for me, what I'm finding and what I'm really going to start pushing for, I think now, is that we need, in order to be able to define a task, you have to be able to find the right level of analysis where the two behaviors, the repetition without repetition, right? You have to find the level at which those two things are in some meaningful sense the same thing. They are the same thing at the level of interacting with the dynamical description of the environment. They are different things if you look at the details of the execution. But my argument is, now we're starting to produce data to show this, is that what the perception action system is interacting with is the underlying dynamics. And so this then connects to all the motor abundance, Mark-Latache synergy stuff, the idea that there's no such thing as a single correct movement, that instead what you're doing on any given time is, it's the repetition without repetition, is that you are trying to interact and your behavior is being structured by the fact that you're interacting with the same task dynamical structure. But because of noise, because of errors, because of all that little bit, you have to make minor corrections, and you do everything. Everything is slightly different every single time, but it all achieves the same goal. And then but the idea then is that if I train you to throw to, actually, let me just step back. So then the idea would be that what you're actually trying to teach in teaching throwing is flexible engagement with that task dynamic. And once you've got that, then you've got the level of sameness where people are, if that task dynamic from the game context is present in the training context, and you teach people to flexibly engage with that task dynamic, then you'll get your transfer. And so the way to identify those pieces is at the level of dynamics. Now, I can do that in the lab in a science context because I've got time, and this is a very non-trivial process, and I'm still working out exactly how to go about doing it. But the goal is to develop some proof of concept from the experimental data, and also to start developing ways of making that dynamical task analysis something that is actually easier and easier to do. So we're not there yet, but what I'm finding in the data is that this is the right way to carve tasks up, right? Perception action systems interact with the world at the level of dynamics through the information that those dynamics create. If you want to carve a task up in a behaviorally relevant way, you have to do it at the level of task dynamics. There are some principles that we've developed that guide you to that right place and seem to be working. Like, I'm getting very good results out of the throwing and understanding why people are doing what they're doing. And once you've got that, then you've got a lot of experimental control in terms of what you can manipulate, where you go looking for transfer. You can make, for the first time, we're starting to make predictions about where we expect transfer to go. That turns out to be a very hard question. But we've now got a framework. This dynamical analysis gives us a framework for predicting when we'd expect to see transfer, because the overlap has to happen at that level. That's the right level of analysis, right? And if the overlap doesn't exist at that level, the information will be different. No transfer.
Your point about accurately describing task dynamics, I think, is actually fundamental to kind of some of the challenges that I think that we face in the coaching context. So I'm 100% convinced that and having worked in a number of sports, so cricket, let's take sports that aren't necessarily massively dynamic, so they don't have like huge team dynamics and all those sorts of things. So if you take sports like cricket, like golf, all those sorts of things, there is an obsessive driver towards aesthetic technical models, and the assumption being that aesthetic technical model equates to skill and performance. Mm-hmm. So I think it's based on a kind of almost like a dynamical systems view of the world, which is, if you can make an organism perform in a certain way, or the various elements of an organism, from a anatomical and musculoskeletal approach, if you can make that organism to perform in a certain way, kind of make it as machine-like as possible, that translates into performance. And 100% I've seen this in terms of. And why it's seductive is that so the training methodology is all derived around the idea of helping the performer fit into an ideal technical visual form, and skill to this day, skill and actually selection and performance is predicated on on how people look. So I have genuinely seen, in cricket particularly, right, somebody who looks right, regardless as if they get no runs, right? They get no runs, but they look right, will be given far longer before they are deselected. Right? This is personal experience. I bet if we did some data analysis on this, we would find this to be true. So it is a little bit of a hypothesis. Will be given far longer and before they're deselected than somebody who looks wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
If somebody looks wrong and they don't perform, they'll be deselected quicker. And the rationale will be, well, clearly that fits against our intuitions. Our intuitions are that this technical model is going to be superior to that technical model.
Yes.
And therefore we will sort of confirm our bias far more rapidly. So that's a little bit of an assumption there, but I've definitely had experiences of this. But because of that drives this sort of fundamental behavior around our job as coaches is to get you to become as aesthetically pleasing technically against orthodoxy as possible. And then people like Lasith Malinga come along and and break the mold, and then all of a sudden our intuitions are broken and we're like, well, what do we do there? So I'm really interested on the throwing piece, right? So obviously, I've got some very live examples. I'd be interested just to kind of do a little bit of a thought experiment with you at the time being. So I've got quite a few kids. They're under 11, so they're all sort of 9, 10, and fielding and all these sorts of things, and to get quite excited about it. Now, I don't do very much in terms of what you might call decoupled fielding practice.
Right.
Very little. So, but what I try and do is games where there might be a lot of opportunities to field. So, for example, quite a few hit and run type games. So the batter isn't getting a lot of decision making there because they've got a hit and run, but the fielders do. And what's very interesting is, like, we watch matches and I see kids and they pick up the ball and the rest of the team are going, "Get it in!" and they're screaming at them and they just literally fall apart, right? But what I want to talk to you about is I've got 3 or 4 kids, my son included, who feel that the best way to throw is to almost have a horizontal arm. Right. I call it the kind of Malinga slinger throw, right? And their accuracy is just everywhere. And I think it's because fundamentally they've misunderstood the dynamics of the task. So I think their task is what their perception, if you like, or what they're getting is that my task is to sling this projectile as hard as I possibly can. So they're kind of doing it in almost like a discus motion because that, I think, feels intuitively to them the best means of developing power.
Absolutely.
But if I was to reframe the task dynamics by giving them slightly different, kind of framing it a different way, giving it different information sources by manipulating what's available to them, by saying, for example, you have to throw this ball and hit that objective, otherwise you're out. So the equivalent of cricket batter. I wonder if that would, and I might test this tonight, I wonder if that would change the movement pattern they chose.
It might eventually, right?
Yes.
So in my not very illustrious cricket career in high school, I had the same sort of thing, right? I very much, because I'm not very big and strong, in order to generate that kind of power, I did used to kind of sling it like that. And of course, one of the weirdnesses, one of the things that's very interesting about throwing is the fact that in order to get an accurate throw, you have to land your release within a very tight launch window that's defined actually by the dynamics of projectile motion, and that window time-wise is tiny, right? It'll be on the order of a few milliseconds. If you cock it up on either side, then you'll miss, right? The timing requirements are astonishing. So with an overhand throw, if you miss it a little bit, all the error is in sort of the vertical dimension, which means you get basically into the right plane of motion, you get it in the right place, and then your fielder can do a bit of adaptation to like catch a high one or a low one or whatever. But if you cock it up horizontally, right, then the errors are way away. They're the tiny little angular difference corresponds to a huge distance by the time you get there. But that's it. Why are they doing that? Well, one reason is they're trying to generate power because they want to be able to cross the distance. And you have to be able to, if you're throwing under time pressure, then you need to throw as flat as possible in order to minimize the flight time. If you're throwing flat, that means you need to have a very high release velocity in order to cross the distance, right? The other way to cross the distance is to throw it very high with a lower velocity, but obviously much longer flight time, which means that you don't get that run out, right? So they're working on, so what are they working on? They're working on in a context in which the time pressure is forcing them, or means that of the two possible ways of crossing the distance, high and slow, flat and fast is the one that's most behaviorally relevant, but fast is hard. Absolutely, right? It's the increased speed makes it harder to land in the launch window. Generating that speed requires very careful, very precise coordination as you take all the energy you store in the trunk and whip it down the arm. If you're, there's a lot of opportunities down that kinetic chain to be losing energy, etc. So high quality throwing requires this incredible coordination. That coordination is really hard. And if you're 9 and 10, and maybe not, I don't know, maybe not as big, for example, then you're going to try and find a way. So what you're trying to do, you're trying to reframe the question as one as being about accuracy. Take the time pressure off maybe initially and get them back into the overhand throw where, you're just saying, right, the overhand throw where all the action is in the vertical plane is actually the better one, because small errors in that can be accommodated more easily by the fielder at the other end. But that's, it's a hard throw to do. So I play softball, and it took me a long time to learn to throw a ball properly. And I had to spend a lot of time just practicing it, that sort of motion, so that it became the default thing. But then, of course, the problem is in the game context, the time pressure is going to be back on, right? Yeah. So what you're going to see is that even in training, they might be starting to get it, but under pressure of the game context, until that throw becomes just the way you throw a ball, the whole thing's going to disintegrate in the game context under the time pressure, right? So there's going to be a lot of, it's the right way to train them, but there's going to be it's going to take longer, and it's going to be harder, and performance is going to be more variable for a longer time, and that has motivational consequences, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why I'm trying to develop it within a game form.
Yeah.
So that there's the enjoyment factor of the game form.
Yeah.
It's a relatively safe space from an error perspective. Yes. I mean, I'm just reflecting actually the idea of, if you don't hit the target, you're out. There may be too much pressure on that, right, which would actually bring about some, maladaptive throwing behavior.
Yeah.
Speed would go down, for example, all those sorts of things. So, but what I'm trying to explore really is just to try and find a means by which I can focus using the by reframing the task and using appropriate constraints to get them into the idea of saying, because at the moment they're just, because there's so many sources of information for them, they've basically just got attuned to the idea that speed is everything.
Yes, well, because there's the time pressure, right?
Exactly.
We're trying to get the runner out, right? So that immediately creates time pressure. As soon as you've got time pressure, then you want to get high speed. As soon as you get high speed is very difficult in a throw, and there's an easy but not very adaptive way of doing that, which is the horizontal sling. But it's not so adaptive and it's not so functional because tiny errors become a problem. The first thing I would try would be take the time pressure off. I don't create a game context where, in fact, you get them out not by getting the ball there on time, but by getting it to a certain location, right? The batter is out if the ball arrives in a location where the fielder can catch it without moving a foot, for example.
Yeah. We actually, funny enough, we played some decoupled games like that. Well, it was semi-decoupled because we still had a batsman running.
Yeah.
So it was an element of time pressure, but it wasn't like the full game pressure. Yeah. So there was batsman running, and I afforded it differently. So you got rewarded for the fielder, the wicketkeeper, catching the ball without having to move.
That's it. That's the kind of thing. And then of course the other thing you want is variability of practice, right?
Sure.
So again, you don't just want to be training the same thing over and over, right? You want to be training flexible engagement with a context. And of course, the game context has that variability where sometimes the time pressure is on, sometimes the time pressure is off. So, I mean, that's a tricky question. There's no sort of general principles for identifying how to balance these things out, but creating sort of a balanced, sort of a varied environment where the basic pressure is on accuracy, but where improving speed is also, it's certainly a thing that you can do in order to achieve the task goal. So that you don't just end up, because actually what you want to learn is the initial thing, if you're focused on accuracy, if you're not very good at speed, the thing you'll have to do is to throw high and slow.
Yeah.
You're just going to have to suck that up. Right. Weirdly, actually, throwing high and slow works, but it's actually, if you can increase your speed a little bit, then you end up in a much more stable, error-tolerant region of the space, weirdly. So So you need to find some way of encouraging the speed to increase as well.
Well,
Time's an issue. You've got to get them in the ballpark first before you can start honing them in. So you've got to create a situation first where their preferred action solution is the one that's going to be more functional later, further on in time and further on in training. So you've got to get them in the ballpark first. So there's an order. Again, time is a factor here, literally a factor. It's
or I suppose I give them enough variable repetitions of their chosen movement solution, so that they reduce the accuracy error whilst retaining their. Now there are going to be challenges to that, because as we know, there are the physics of this. Probably, I imagine the timing window on a horizontal action versus a vertical action is even smaller.
Quite possibly, but worse, the consequences of missing that window are larger, independent of everything else. Yeah.
But that's not to say that it's not possible.
Yeah. Well, because for a friend, there's a friend of mine who plays softball. He's got a very solid arm, very reliable thrower, and he has a real horizontal arm swing. Like, it's soul crushing to watch. And so I'm like, George, what are you doing? Come on, man. But when he does it, he's so good at it. He has got good enough at it now that he can, like, if he's pitching or if he's standing at shortstop, he can whiz it into first base very reliably. And at very high speeds, which means he crosses the distance and gets the runner out. So he has certainly found a way to make it work, and his errors are very rare. So even though the pressure is very high, because the consequences of errors, a tiny error just becomes very magnified. It's not that it's impossible, right? Especially in the context of throwing. Humans, we've specialized in throwing in a lot of very interesting kinds of ways. So we have the capacity to reach that level of precision. That is definitely the other way to think about it, right? Is to, instead of trying to teach the correct form, this form is more functional, more adaptive, more flexible. Will enable more successful flexible interaction with the task environment. But it's not the case that the sidearm is just intrinsically terrible. It just has it's a motion that comes with certain constraints on it, has some limitations. It ups the demand for being accurate, but that it doesn't up the demand to the point where it's impossible.
Yeah, so I feel my role, and I want to come back to something that you mentioned earlier on, which is important, but I feel my role is to allow these young developing human beings who are learning to have enough experiences of various movement forms to begin to understand when one might be suitable over another. So, for example, I can see a moment where a horizontal arm swing is exactly the right movement. So, for instance, in a rapid run out context, right, where you quick single, I've got to pick up the ball. I haven't got time to get into a vertical position because we're talking about so I've got to literally on the move, I've got to sling it probably whilst I'm falling over and still deliver that with a degree of accuracy. So that movement pattern is probably really suitable in certain situations, and it's worth the risk of it going wrong.
Because you want it in your repertoire, because it's adaptive under some circumstances.
Yeah, so my intuition's to go, no, don't do it that way, do it this way, because this is an appropriate movement form. That I need to disabuse myself of those, because what I'm saying is that, look, what you're doing there is fine, but the problem is what we want to do is find all the options available to us to be able to propel the object with sufficient accuracy and speed, given a set of circumstances. Yeah. So that's one thing. Just coming back to the other point, I'm wondering whether, going back to your point earlier about task dynamics, I'm wondering whether our role as coaches, so I think fundamentally, a lot of people have thought that going back to your point about schema theory, that the role of coaches is to try and create optimal movement patterns. The whole concept of fundamental movement skills is predicated on that idea.
Absolutely.
I think the role of coaches is to help, or should be, in a learning context, to help athletes or sports people to become more attuned to more able to derive appropriate information in relation to the task based on what they perceive. And I think the problem often with athletes is that they're actually just not attuned to that. They're not seeing things, or they're not deriving information, because more often than not, they're actually either doing one or two things. They're mindlessly in performance mode, or they've been given various movement solutions that they're trying to sort of fit into a contextual box somehow, hoping that eventually that's going to kind of work for them. So I feel like our role is to try and design experiences that then and then confer with them or consult with them on what the change dynamics of this experience is now providing for them in information terms, to then determine whether the information that they're deriving is going to give them more or less opportunity to be able to perform. I don't know whether I've got that right or not.
It's the right intuition. The problem we're still lacking is a useful. I can't yet offer you a useful way to drive that process, right? What you guys need is a framework that, like, it's not going to be a set of rules, because it's going to be very much more flexible. But at the moment, we're still just lacking a clear articulation of the basic underlying principles of this task dynamical approach in a way that you could then look at a situation and use that analysis to guide what you then told the athlete. That said, now I'm not a coach, I don't pretend to be, but everything I just said earlier about the nature of throwing, etc., all came from my now fairly clear understanding of the task dynamics of intercepting a target with a projectile. And all that's come from, a bunch of simulations and all the stuff that we've done. But, whenever I'm thinking about the nature of the task, so when I'm thinking about the trade-off between release velocity, release angle, release time, flight time, all those kinds of things, all I'm doing is I've done the task dynamical analysis. I've got a very good sense now of the dynamics of projectile motion and what that looks like in the context of human throwing. All I'm doing now is pulling out the various elements of that dynamic and thinking about how to tweak them, right? So if I'm thinking about, right, so why are they throwing? So again, right, why are they throwing with this sidearm motion? Your analysis was spot on. It's not that they're willfully trying to do something stupid. It's that they are trying to skillfully engage with the task that you've set them up under their own effectivity constraints, and also, they've come with, maybe being able to do this one more easily. So, of course, when you're trying to succeed and you're trying to throw fast and you're trying to look like you can do something, you go to the thing you've already got some capacity to do, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Because there's a cost to training. Overhand throwing is bloody hard, right? It's really difficult to learn how to do this. That sidearm motion is very natural because it takes some of the pressures off. Mm-hmm. It places pressures in other places, but it takes some of the production pressures off, I think. But the moral of the story is, I think that the task dynamic, like everything I said, was me just thinking through my dynamical understanding of what the task of throwing is about.
Yeah.
And the dynamical analysis, the task of throwing is the production of a certain kind of motion, a projectile motion, which behaves in a certain kind of way. The dynamics of that unfold in a certain kind of way for certain reasons. That description just gives me a bunch of it. What it does is it allows me to carve the task a little bit at its joints. And so all the things I'm thinking about, I would hope, at least this would be the question, right? For me, the question would be, that analysis has been quite useful for me scientifically. Now the real question is where the rubber would really meet the road to see if I'm actually carving the task at the right joints, would be to use that analysis to drive some sort of training program. Yeah. And I'd be nervous about advocating that right now just because I'm always a bit conservative about these things. But I want, like, this is it. I'm talking to people like yourself. I've got that big picture in my head now as I'm busy trying to figure out ways of articulating what I'm learning in a way that could possibly be useful, right? Because the whole point of this is to identify, once you identify what a task is and are correctly characterizing what a task is from the point of view of a skilled organism, then the only reason to do that is so that, then another way of testing it, but also where the rubber meets the road, is to take that description and try and use it to do something, right? So I've got for example, I have some learning data that I need to go back to and analyze actually for the throwing stuff. Now that I've got the dynamical analysis worked up, I need to go back to that data and have a look at it. But I've also been thinking about that experiment that we ran, that particular learning data was, the particular experiment we ran was generated for other reasons. Now I'm thinking about, now I've got a very amazing collaboration at Carnegie, the School of Sports in Carnegie at Leeds Beckett. Some amazing people there, but primarily I've got access to people who know a bunch of really useful motor control analyses, but also just the biomechanics lab of my dream, right? Multiple high-speed cameras in a big hall where I can do the throwing. We've collected already a bunch of amazing data. When I now think about the learning studies that I want to start running to kind of push this analysis, I'm thinking very differently. Now that I've got that task dynamical analysis in my head, I'm thinking about poking and manipulating very different things now. So I'm looking to use that analysis to guide poking things and developing things in a certain way, understanding learning, because that's where you find out whether or not you've carved, nature at her joints, right? And the thing that we've discovered, and the thing that Danny's been working on with all the transfer of learning we've uncovered, is that that's exactly the process that everybody else went through, Schmidt and everybody. They figured out a way of characterizing what the task was, and then everybody tried to use that notion of what the task was to structure the way they developed learning and training programs. But all the evidence just shows that it turned out we'd broken it up in the wrong way.
Yeah.
And so coming from the ecological approach, I'm using that theory as I'm being just as nailed to it as I possibly can, and I'm trying to come up with a different way of defining tasks. And so far in the lab, I'm getting some good success, but who knows, right? We won't know for 20 years till we really try and track this sort of stuff out. And for me, the thing that gets interesting is, of course, there's a real cost for you guys in just switching to some entirely new way of doing something, right? Especially in really high performance sports and basically where the stakes, where the money is high, right?
Yeah.
There's going to be a cost to transferring over to this new way of thinking about things. And those short-term costs might turn into long-term benefits, but those short-term costs might have huge consequences, and they might really mitigate against just mucking about.
Well, yes, but it depends on how you can only view the cost when you weigh it against the potential benefit.
Yes. Oh, I agree.
Yeah. So again, there is a time factor here. So in some professional sports contexts where there's very little developmental time from kind of competition to competition, yeah, I can totally understand that coaches form of life, we talk about form of life quite a bit, their methodology is in large way constrained by the experience that they find themselves within, yes, and what they can do. However, within that, it depends again what our outcome is. So if you're, again, I was talking to this professional baseball coach about this, and he was saying, look, I'm going to find this very difficult to do with the kind of starting guys. I said, I'm not surprised. There's too much of a potential downside for them. But the ones who are struggling, the ones who are searching, was the phrase. I said, actually, they might be the ones who are more open to some experimentation, because they're in the dark anyway, so they're looking for some light.
Absolutely. They'll be willing to try it, right? And also start trying these things out in the development squads and all that sort of stuff. Like, there's potential costs there as well, because if, you're trying to develop these younger players up to reach the first team, and, you've done this in a certain way for a certain period of time. But I think actually you're right. I think people who are close to being in that first team but aren't quite making it under the current sort of analysis, the current metrics that people are applying, absolutely, because the stakes are so high, they would actually be the kind of people who might be up for trying some stuff. And, you hear a lot of stories about people who become sort of really amazing athletes, and they become the amazing athlete because they tried something a bit wacky, right? Yeah. I was just to talk yesterday, Rich Ivory was just talking about the Fosbury flop, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And basically, Fosbury wasn't a particularly great high jumper, right? He was good, but he wasn't anywhere near the top of his field. And then one day invented the Fosbury flop, and suddenly was, because of the nature of that technique, was able to jump a whole bunch higher. And then that got him to the Olympics, and I think he won. And then 4 years later, everybody was doing it. And so all the better people had now just overtaken him, right? Yeah. But it was just kind of interesting that that initial innovation by him, that exploration, that willingness, because he was not at the top, he was good, but he was not at the top. He was willing to make that experimentation and try stuff out, and it paid off. People then caught up with him because there were other things going on. But yeah, that innovation it absolutely can pay off, right? And there's a ton of stories around like that.
Yeah, but at the same time, sometimes it's not necessarily about. So going back to the point I made earlier on, there are governing bodies out there who have, and what I'm working in one in field hockey,
right?
And I think rugby are in this direction. The FA are definitely coming in this space in a big way, and they are essentially talking. What they're doing is talking in different language. So developmentally, we can do this, can't we?
Yeah.
But interestingly, what they're doing is, in terms of, so for example, tomorrow morning I'll be doing a workshop on practice design for skill acquisition, and we'll talk about principles of nonlinear pedagogy, some ecological dynamic stuff. Yeah. And one of the things I talk about with them a lot is that England Hockey created this new talent development framework, And what they've done is they've said, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to create environments, and there's going to be learning environments, and they have these characteristics and what have you. But nothing in this talent development framework is there. Do they talk anything about technique or technical? So that what they haven't done is to say a talented athlete will be able to perform these techniques. What they've said is they'll have these psychological characteristics, they'll have these physical characteristics, and they will be able to perform in the game. And they'll also have these kind of dynamical characteristics, such as they will be creative, and they'll be active problem solvers, and all these sorts of things. What that does is that leads us into a different space, because what we're now not doing is just trying to do a series, assimilate a series of techniques, and then those who have those techniques most effectively will then use. What we're trying to say is actually what we want to do is people who can intuitively understand the problems that the game is going to throw at them. And fundamentally, the problems are you've got to be able to carry the ball, you've got to be able to propel the ball, you've got to be able to put the ball in the goal. You've got to stop others from doing so by denying space, trying to steal the ball away from them, and there's another one as well, cohesive dynamic pressing. But let's just say, so they're the problems that we're going to try and solve collectively. And the starting point is, right, what is it that you are perceiving about the task of carrying the ball?
Right.
And what are the opportunities for action available to you around carrying the ball, given these set of circumstances? So there's a person in the way now. What are we going to do about them? But we're not saying that there are right and wrong ways of carrying the ball.
Right.
We're just exploring the effectiveness of different ways of carrying the ball. And I think that's one of the ways they've overcome this, by despecifying task dynamics. We're able to allow for exploration, certainly in those developmental phases. I think later in the pathway, we might become more refining, and we might start to say, maybe we're going to jettison some of these less effective opportunities and stay with others. But, or we might, collectively, because of the tactical approach we're taking, we might say that we're going to jettison some of these because of their less effective approaches. But we're allowing the athlete to do that over a period of time based on how the task dynamics are going to change, given the problems they have to solve.
That's a really healthy approach, I think. Like that, and it's funny, like that's actually really interesting. What's been designed with that document and that framework is an environment that provides room for that exploration, for that development of personalized ways of skillfully interacting with the game context, right? As opposed to, and it's created, so actually, like, this is what good policy does, right? And a good framework does. What it does is it creates appropriate space, placing some boundaries on it, right? You have to be learning hockey and not something else, but those boundaries have to be appropriate and structured. But it sounds like the document is very much constraining the space down to a point where it's sort of useful and can be used to guide people, but it's not so constraining that you have to be doing things in a certain way. And if the one thing we know now about movement patterns is that there is simply no such thing as the correct technique. What there is the ability to flexibly and skillfully interact with a task dynamical environment. And that's where that's the whole, in the science literature, that's coming from Latache and all the synergy stuff, all the people doing sort of uncontrolled manifold analysis and all those kinds of analyses, just looking at, focused on how the movement system constrains variability. Variability is very much part of the system, and some of that variability can be useful. Sometimes it can take you away from the task goal. You don't care about the stuff. The whole analysis, the whole UCM idea is that you try and clamp down on variability in your performance that's screwing you up, and you try and preserve the variability, or you don't care about the variability that doesn't interfere with you. And what that good variability gives you is space to maneuver. So as you're executing the movement, you've got to make a tiny little correction. There's room in the system because there's more than one way to do anything. So that flexibility, that multiple solutions, that adaptivity, they're all features. They're all deep features, not bugs. And it's the nature of the system. And so it sounds like, for me, that framework sounds like it's taking that idea very seriously, trying to provide a way in which you can guide people but not constrain them in appropriate ways. So absolutely. But that's a nice point as well, is that there's a very clear role for the governing bodies. They have to create that. If they create that space, then, effectively you're changing the incentive structure, right? Instead of incentivizing perfect technique, you're incentivizing flexible adaptation and adaptive interaction with the environment. So by their very nature, as the athletes and the coaches try to do their best according to that framework, you get a bit of self-organization, right? It's a very, the lower level components of the system, the coaches, the athletes will negotiate new ways of doing things in response to what it is that this new thing that they're trying to achieve. So there's a very important role for governing bodies, absolutely.
And it's fascinating as I roll this out and I'm delivering this. So, we talk a lot about, they have a concept, idea of a golden thread, where they say, look, every environment or session experience that the athletes should have these 5 components, and they should be there should be fun. You should get lots of goes. There should be decisions to be made. There should be an element of stretch. And there's another one that I can never remember. But one of the things they're saying is that they just said that's all you got to do as a coach. That's all you've got to do is just think about it in those terms. What's really interesting though is there is always a debate in these contexts of, but if you haven't got the basics, you can't play the game. And there's this idea of the basics. And I'm saying, we had a very long debate about, kind of almost like, what's the word I'm looking for? A long debate around kind of like, norms. So there's a lot of kind of conventions in all sports. And trying to break some of those conventions. Like, so in hockey, for example, the idea is it's more effective to carry the ball on one side of the field with the flat part of the stick on one side, because the implement is designed to do that, and that's the most effective way of using the implement. But going back to coffee cups, well, actually, what if you have it on the other side of the body? Yes, you've still got to use the flat side, but why is that a less effective way of doing it? In some contexts, when you've got a defender over this side of you, that's a really effective way of carrying the ball. Absolutely. But we teach everybody to carry it on this side. What's wrong with having it on this side? Well, it's just harder. Well, is that just because we've had less goes at it?
Absolutely. And even if it's hard, even if it remains more difficult, having that trick up your sleeve suddenly makes you a more flexible, adaptive player. Suddenly, and especially like when new tricks come up in sports, right? You see this every now and again, right? When some, say all your hockey players had added the knack of being able to carry the ball on the opposite side, and that wasn't very common across hockey. The first time that shows up in a game context, you're going to completely bamboozle the opposition, because everything about their defense plans and their defensive sort of strategies is all premised on the idea that the ball's going to be over here. What's going to happen is that you're simply going to reverse everything, and all of a sudden nothing that they do is now well afforded by the environment, right? But then you get into all kinds of interesting arms races, because of course but you see this in sports all the time. Someone comes up with a new offensive trick and it works for a while, and then the defenses start to adapt, and so you get into this very interesting kind of arms race. Nobody's teaching the details of that new trick or the new defensive response. It's not about perfect technique. That's not how you do it. What you get is the people who do well are the ones who can flexibly adapt. Right? And, but you see it all the time. You see that one trick that comes out for a little while that works really well, but then it's really interesting to watch the game adapt around it. And the game adapts in a very unguided way, right? It's not a clearly specified solution. People try stuff out, manipulate things, figure out what's going on. And, there'll often be a good solution that everybody kind of converges on. I can't remember. So there was a good one in baseball a little while ago. I can't remember what it was. There was something that changed in the game, and then the fielding configuration had to change in a certain way, and everybody settled on this one solution. But it took a little bit of time, and it was very much a bottom-up kind of exploration process that had to happen, and then everybody had to learn how to flexibly engage with the environment in that new configuration, because it changed a bunch of stuff. So So if you that's it. I think the most important thing out of the dynamical and ecological approaches is just that recognition that time and the order in which things happen is a critical defining characteristic. That's the dynamical system sort of understanding. Time matters. Things take time. Things happen. Systems respond. Some of those responses, the nature of those responses, everything's sort of talking to each other and feeding back into each other and all that sort of stuff. But the order in which stuff happens matters. That's very interesting, actually. Very cool.
Yeah. There's a whole arena that we haven't touched, but I'm conscious of your time, and also I've got a couple of bits and pieces I've got to sort out for this week before I go away on holiday next week. I am. Do you know what? It's a fascinating hour and a half that's just literally flown by. there's a definite space. I always like to leave these sort of things dangling. There's a definite, I'd love to get into the whole embodied cognition space, because that's an area that I'm just finding really, really interesting. And I think resonates very closely with all of this stuff, but we'll leave that for another day. Dangle that carrot for the listeners. I mentioned at the start, Andrew, that you're like very active in the kind of in the blogging space, and quite active on social media. I even dragged you into a discussion on Twitter in my world, and I felt very, very bad for that, because then you're trying to extricate yourself from it when you got all these people bombarding you with questions.
It's all good. I'm always up for that. We're always up for a good argument on Twitter.
So anyway, so you are very active. So if people wanted to sort of, kind of dig into the research a little bit more, and I know you've got loads of links and loads of research, everything you've used in this podcast, all the references, I'm sure they'll find on the blog. Where do they find you? How do they interact?
So let's see. So I'm at Psych Scientists on Twitter. And so people are more than welcome to come and chat with me there. That's the easiest way to find me. That Twitter account then has links to the blog, etc. So the blog is named The Notes from Two Scientific Psychologists. That was me and Sabrina doing our thing. It's trying to remember the URL now. It's psychsciencenotes.blogspot.com, I think, because I'll have to go dig that out again. But that's all linked from the Twitter account. Yeah. There's a ton of stuff there. There's a couple of so I need to go through and update and tidy this and figure out a better way to present it. But if you have a look, there's a page on the blog called the Rough Guide to the Blog. And basically I've tried to take all the posts and sort them by topic. I need to go back. I need to find a slightly better way of presenting that information. But broadly speaking, there's a bunch of posts on sort of the bigger theoretical stuff. There's a bunch of posts on very specific research programs. So all the coordination dynamics, all the throwing stuff that I'm doing, I spend a lot of time blogging about, trying to explain and articulate what I'm learning. So that's probably quite a good place to start as well. But basically, if anybody ever wants to come bug me on Twitter and just say, what would you recommend reading about X, Y, or Z, or I think you're an insane person, defend yourself, Twitter is by far and away the best place to find me. The only thing I'll flag up is I'm about to go off on holiday. I'm taking the kids to Australia and New Zealand for a holiday, so I'm away for most of August, and I'll be doing my best to ignore work. But other than that, after that, bring it on.
Well, I hope you have a great time. I know there's an article on there which is how to explain ecological psychology to an 8-year-old.
Yes.
Which was a great article for me, and I recommend it to everybody, because it's like that kind of,
place to start. That was, to be honest, I still need to crank it down a notch. I'm always working on ways of, I'm always working on ways of communicating these ideas clearly. That's why I like, so for example, these podcasts and talking to a more general audience, for example, it's very good for me, because I'm trying to find ways of articulating what at one level it's a lot of very complicated stuff. But at another level, I'm trying to find ways of articulating it as clearly and as usefully as possible. So it's always good to get feedback on how it's going. So if you read something and just go, what are you talking about? Then, let me know, because I want, I would like people to know what I'm talking about.
Well, there's a raging debate at the moment around, some people who are, just even unhappy with the use of the term affordances and yes. feel it like it's exclusive, it's exclusive and it doesn't allow people to interact. I'm still of the mindset that, in order to embrace any concept, you have to begin to understand the vocabulary. Yes, and so actually it's just, I'm going to unashamedly keep going with that, because actually it's about more people becoming aware of these ideas, which I think is why it's so useful to explain the difference between affordance and information right at the start.
Yeah, and I agree entirely about that. Right now, I'm very happy to talk about affordances, because I'm finding it a very useful way of framing a discussion about what it is I'm doing in my research. The day that stops working will be the day I'll stop talking about affordances. So far, so good. But that's it. If it stops working, I'm not nailed to it. And this is one of the things I always respected about Gibson. He was very much a moving target. He was constantly trying to make what he was doing better and clearer and more sort of focused and useful. So he wrote stuff in his 50s book, and then he abandoned it for the 60s book, and he wrote a bunch of cool stuff in the 60s books, some of which stayed and some of which just got jettisoned. But it always got jettisoned for good reasons. It was just like, look, that was my current thinking. The more I got into it, it just didn't work. So I reformulated it in this way, and that's my current thinking. He wrote the 79 book, and he died that year. But the book came out, and he spent most of that last year. He was working on the next book. He had already redefined and started thinking about stuff again. So I take a lot of inspiration from that. So right now, everything on the blog, or a lot of stuff on the blog, is the way I'm currently thinking about stuff.
Yeah.
it's not the right answer. It's just the way I'm currently interacting with it. And I'm always looking for better ways of articulating and communicating it. And for me, things like affordances and stuff like that, they have a lot of power because I'm finding them very useful. And I think they're very important sort of characteristics of the theory. But if they end up being more trouble than they're worth, and if we find a better way of doing it, then hooray, that'd be awesome.
There are members of the academic community who are quite dismissive of people who are kind of essentially thinking out loud using media like blog or podcasts.
Yeah.
But I have to say, I have found it extremely useful that you've been prepared to do that and put out there just thoughts and concepts and ideas and be prepared to have that sort of feedback. And I feel, going back to what you were saying about, kind of the research community, I think the more that can happen and the more dialogue we can have like this, I think that's going to be better in terms of the experiences we're providing for young people. So, hey, I appreciate it for one anyway.
Look, I'm glad it's useful to you. But the main reason I've been doing it is it's mind-meltingly useful for me too. And I'm just thrilled that other people are finding it useful as well. That's great. But it's interesting now, like we're getting into that point with the dialogue now where it's like I'm doing this and dumping stuff out as I try to think about things, but I'm also now aware that people are reading it and now trying to think about ways of connecting. So it's great. I love it. It's, to the extent. And if it's, like I say, if it's not working for you, bug me on Twitter and I'll see what I can do.
Andrew, I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
No problem. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.
Kapow. Wow. That felt like a roller coaster of a conversation. I absolutely loved every minute of that. For me, it really felt like a proper dialogue back and forward, research as a practitioner and sort of application through to theory. And I was just massively appreciative of Andrew giving up his time to sort of have that kind of conversation with me. And I hope we can definitely do that again. And I hope you guys got something out of that as well. There's just so much in there. I'm going to have to listen back and start digging in. I was trying to take notes as we were going along, but there was just so much that it's one of those that I'll have to get back into. So anyway, hope you have some fun with that one. Go and play around with it, see if there's some things out there, and then fire me over an email. Let me know how you're getting on, and we can whiz some field notes over to Andrew maybe and give him some feedback on what's taking place. So I'd be excited to get that. As always, if you want to get on board, support these audio endeavours, these audio adventures, then hit the website. There's a couple of buttons there now. There's the Patreon button, and also there's now a PayPal one if you want to go down that route. And any support's most appreciated. In the meantime, have a great week of coaching. I'm off to France to spend some much needed downtime. But in the meantime, ditch those drills.